Greetings and blessings, and welcome back to another edition of Curious Naked Diatribes. This time around, we're taking a look at Venezuela, which has been in the news quite a lot recently, and probably for the wrong reasons. We'll get into those in a moment. The question I'd like you to answer for yourselves after this episode is, why is it that the US is so interested in regime change in Venezuela? You may have heard about the numerous documented strikes on vessels in the Eastern Pacific and Caribbean by the U.S. military beginning in early September, resulting in dozens of casualties, with reports of civilian fishermen among the dead. The U.S. calls them drug boats, but Venezuelan officials and families on the coast call them fishing boats. They say the confirmed narco-terrorists were fathers and brothers, and that the U.S. has provided zero evidence, no photos of seized drugs, no names of kingpins, just the word of the same military apparatus that gave us the Gulf of Tonkin and WMDs in Iraq. We're simply asked to blindly believe what the U.S. military has confirmed and take their claims as facts without further scrutiny. Narco-terrorist is a strongly loaded term, and one that's been applied to President Maduro plenty of times, with a very specific purpose. It's used to cast Maduro as an evil dictator demon figure, and thereby justify his removal, using deadly force if necessary, as we learned from this clip from 60 Minutes.
There's three ways this can go, according to a lot of the people that we spoke to, which is he packs his bags and leaves, or he's picked up. There's this big bounty for his arrest, so he could be picked up. That's number two. Or he can meet his maker. It's not a question of if, but a question of when.
Does that sound like a democratic process to you? Now let's turn our attention to another figure in Venezuela, this year's Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Corina Machado. So let's take a look at the Peace Laureate's record. She signed a decree dissolving democracy during a U.S.-backed coup. She has championed sanctions that the UN calls collective punishment. She helped lead violent protests that left dozens dead. And she has openly, repeatedly, called for a foreign military to invade her own country. Sounds like a real peacemaker, right? I remember seeing social media blow up in response to Machado's award and nodding my head in agreement as people expressed their disbelief and outrage. If Machado won the Peace Prize, many said, then peace has no meaning. It really raises some serious questions about the prize committee, who, after all, awarded the Peace Prize to Henry fucking Kissinger. Ugh. So who is Maria Corina Machado? Well, as I mentioned, she's an opposition leader in Venezuela who has supported U.S. military interventions. She has repeatedly called for U.S. intervention to remove Maduro. She's supported Trump's naval buildup in the Caribbean and the deadly strikes on Venezuelan boats. Machado is someone who has aligned herself with hardline far-right figures like Trump, Marco Rubio, Jair Bolsonaro, Javier Milei. She even wrote a letter to Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, asking for help in overthrowing her own country's government. Can you imagine someone in the U.S. doing that? Then we've got her unwavering support for crippling U.S. sanctions in Venezuela, which began as far back as 2005. These sanctions have had deadly consequences, creating economic devastation, preventing food, goods, and medicine from entering Venezuela, and magnifying the country's humanitarian crisis. Let's talk about her involvement in violent protests. In 2014, she led the La Salida protest, and again in 2017, leaving dozens dead after violence between far-right figures and state forces. And finally, let's talk about her history of anti-democratic actions. In 2002, during the coup, yes, the one ousting enormously popular Hugo Chavez, she signed the Carmona Decree dissolving Venezuela's democratic institutions, and she boycotted any negotiation processes. So the more you look into Machado's history, the more galling it is that she received the Peace Prize. So one has to wonder, is this prize promoting a legacy of peace? Or simply providing a moral cover for U.S. imperialism, war, and violence? But to really understand Machado's role in all of this, let's rewind a bit and get into some historical context. 1999, Hugo Chavez is elected president after popular rejection of Venezuela's elite two-party system. Sound familiar? He inaugurates the Bolivarian Revolution after Simón Bolívar's dream of Latin American unity, rewriting the constitution via a popular assembly and establishing a participatory democracy. Imagine that. He explicitly names the state's role in the management of social welfare. Chavez takes control of the state oil company and diverts profits away from international shareholders and toward funding for social programs in health, education, and housing. And of course, the US sees this as a big red flag, a major provocation, and thus the beginning of Chavez's trouble. In 2002, the US backs the Carmona Decree coup, temporarily ousting Chavez. The Carmona Decree dismantles Venezuela's democratic institutions, signed by who? You guessed it, Maria Corina Machado. But due to Chavez's popular support and loyal military factions, the coup doesn't stick. Chavez is back in power in a few days, and he's more dedicated than ever to the Bolivarian Revolution. He continues building alliances in the region, establishes Petrocaribe, essentially cheap oil traded with those regional allies, and he continues ties with China, Russia, and Iran, really thumbing his nose at old Uncle Sam. Then in 2013, Chavez dies. His successor, Nicolás Maduro, wins a narrow election, and in the following year, big problems begin for Venezuela. Global oil prices crash, which highlight Venezuela's overdependence on oil. And this new economic pain really emboldens Machado and the opposition to launch La Salida, the exit, a campaign calling for Maduro's resignation and involving violent protests. Then in 2017, the US imposes new economic sanctions in an effort to force Maduro out. The United Nations considers this to be collective punishment, since it meant more pain for average Venezuelans. Hyperinflation, mass migration, just a really bad scene. Now, to be clear, this is not to say the Maduro government is completely blameless. There are well-documented issues of corruption, economic mismanagement, and political repression. But Washington's response hasn't been to support democracy. It's been to exploit that suffering, to make it worse with sanctions, and to prop up a minority faction of the opposition whose commitment to democracy is, as we've seen, highly questionable. 2019 comes with a new plot twist. The US and its allies recognize Juan Guaidó as interim president, attempting to further undermine Maduro's legitimacy as president. Ultimately, this fails in what I consider to be one of the most laughable chapters in Venezuela's history. And that, my friends, is the quick and dirty history of Venezuela since Chavez. Which brings us up to the mess we have today in 2025. Now, some of you astute observers of US political theater may recall how brazen Trump was in his first term, talking very openly about taking Venezuela's oil.
How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
So the fact that the current US regime is putting on this big charade about a drug war is frankly insulting to me and probably anyone else who's been paying attention to foreign affairs. But the facade is crumbling, I believe, and the standard playbook used by US empire for decades is no longer working. An independent Venezuela wasn't supposed to exist. But the fact that it does, and it has for so long, despite all the standard tactics and coercive pressure applied against it, speaks to the changing tide of global politics. Venezuela stands as a powerful symbol of the rejection of US hegemony. Whatever may happen in the coming weeks and months, one thing is certain: Venezuela isn't going down without a fight. And honestly, neither should we. The next time you hear a pundit or politician talk about narco-terrorists in Venezuela, you now know the story behind the headline. Your job is to be a skeptic. Your job is to ask the question we started with. Why? Share this information. Break the consensus. Because the first front in any war is the battle over the story itself. For further reading on the political situation in Venezuela, check out Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire by Anya Parampil. That does it for this episode of Curious Naked Diatribes, a production of Javi Media, on the web at javimedia.net. Also on our website, be sure to check out Javi Media Radio, bilingual, community-powered, independent. Send your comments, questions, or rants to javimediaradio@proton.me. Thanks for listening. Que todo sea amor, walk tall, live free. Javi Media.